Hi, I'm Rachel. I want to tell you about the night my own sister looked me in the eye in a room full of tailored suits and diamond earrings and told me to leave early so I wouldn't embarrass her in front of her friends. What she didn't know was that 6 weeks later, one of the wealthiest men in that very room would walk into my office, shake my hand, and call me director right in front of her. For years, I told myself that being the responsible one meant I'd never really belong anywhere else. Have you ever worked yourself into the ground for people who still introduced you like an afterthought, like you were something to explain away? If that sounds familiar, stay with me to the end, and if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe. It's free, it doesn't cost you a thing, and it's honestly the only reason I get to keep telling them. I grew up in Concord, North Carolina, about 30 minutes outside Charlotte, in a house where money was always tight, but nobody talked about it out loud. My dad worked in maintenance for the school district. My mom did the books for a dental office. I was the oldest, and somewhere around age 12 I became the one who filled out the forms, who remembered the due dates, who translated the insurance letters nobody else wanted to read. My sister Ashley is 3 years younger than me, and she was always the pretty one, the easy one, the one who could walk into a room and make people laugh without trying. I never resented that about her. What I resented came later after she married into a world that made my whole life look small by comparison. I remember one specific afternoon when I was maybe 14, sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of unopened envelopes, sorting them into piles for my mother because she'd started avoiding the mailbox during a stretch when money was especially tight. Ashley was upstairs doing her hair for a school dance, blasting music through the floor, completely unaware that I was quietly figuring out which bill could wait another week and which one couldn't. I didn't resent her for that either, not really. She was 11, and nobody expected an 11-year-old to sort bills. But somewhere in me, a kind of silent contract got written that year. The idea that my worth in this family was tied to how much weight I could quietly carry without anyone having to ask twice. I carried that contract into adulthood without ever really examining it. Ashley met David Calloway at the wedding when she was 26. He came from money, real money, the kind that owns buildings instead of renting apartments in them. His family had been developing hotels and shopping centers around Charlotte for 3 generations, and David himself ran acquisitions for the family company. Within a year, they were engaged. Within 2, they were married in a backyard in Myers Park that cost more than my parents' entire house. I stood up at that wedding in a bridesmaid dress that cost me $400 I didn't really have, and I smiled, and I meant it because I loved my sister. I just didn't know yet what that marriage was going to cost me over the next 6 years. The wedding itself was the first time I really saw the size of the gap opening between our 2 lives. The backyard had been transformed with a clear tent, chandeliers hung from the frame, a live band flown in from Nashville, and a raw bar that alone probably cost more than my entire year of rent at the time. My mother cried during the ceremony, the good kind of crying, and I cried too, standing up there in that $400 dress, watching my little sister marry into a world I couldn't have imagined for either of us growing up in that house in Concord. David's mother wore a bracelet that afternoon that I later learned, from an offhand comment at a different event entirely, was worth more than my parents' mortgage. I didn't think much of it in that moment. I was happy for Ashley. I just didn't yet understand how differently the 2 of us were about to be measured by the people around that tent. By then, I was already working full-time at Merriweather Group, a commercial real estate investment firm in uptown Charlotte, starting as an analyst straight out of college while I finished my master's degree at night. It was not glamorous work in the beginning. I built spreadsheets until midnight. I proofread offering memorandums until my eyes burned. My family called it my little job at the office, the same way you describe a hobby, something to keep me busy until I figured out what I really wanted to do with my life. Meanwhile, Ashley posted photos from Aspen and the Amalfi Coast, and my mother would show them to the neighbors like they were report cards. Nobody ever asked to see mine. I remember one Sunday dinner early in my career when I tried to explain a deal I'd just closed. My first real solo negotiation, a strip mall refinance that had taken 3 months of back and forth with a stubborn lender. I got maybe 2 sentences in before my father asked, not unkindly, just genuinely, So is that like being a realtor? And my mother changed the subject to whether Ashley and David had picked a wedding date, yet before I could even finish answering. I laughed it off at the table. In the car afterward, alone, I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before starting the engine, feeling that particular loneliness of having done something you were proud of and having nowhere, really, to set it down. The first time Ashley asked me to stay away from her friends, she didn't say it like that. She called it something softer. She said, "Rachel, these are David's business partners. It's a whole different world. You don't have to feel like you need to come." I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling something cold settle in my chest, because I understood exactly what she meant, even though she never said the actual words. She meant I wasn't polished enough. She meant my car, a used Honda with 110,000 miles on it, would look wrong parked next to the German sedans in David's parents' circular driveway. I asked her carefully, trying to keep my voice light, whether she was embarrassed of me, and she got quiet for a second before saying, "No, of course not. Don't be dramatic. It's just easier this way." Like ease was a neutral thing, like there was no cost attached to being the sister who made things easier by simply not showing up. I hung up the phone and sat on my kitchen floor for a while, back against the cabinets, running my thumb along a chip in the linoleum I kept meaning to fix. I didn't cry that night. I remember being almost proud of that, like not crying was its own small victory, proof that her words hadn't actually landed anywhere important. It took me years to understand that not crying wasn't strength. It was just the first layer of a habit I was building, the habit of absorbing things quietly, so nobody else would have to feel uncomfortable about them. I said, "Okay." I always said, "Okay," because that is what the responsible daughter does. She absorbs things quietly so the rest of the family doesn't have to feel the weight of them. But it kept happening. A holiday party I heard about after the fact, through a photo online. A milestone anniversary dinner where I got a text 2 days before saying it was mostly work people, David's people, maybe next time. Each time the explanation was smaller and vaguer than the last, and each time I told myself it wasn't personal, it was just circumstance, it was just timing, until the pattern became too obvious to keep explaining away with excuses that never quite fit. By the time Ashley and David had been married 3 years, their world had its own permanent scenery, and I noticed it the way you notice weather. There was the lake house on Lake Norman, where the extended family now spent the 4th of July, instead of my parents' backyard with the plastic pool. There was David's mother's collection of tennis bracelets, one for every anniversary, that Ashley had started wearing herself on special occasions. There was the matty black Range Rover that replaced Ashley's old Jeep the year after the wedding, parked next to David's Porsche in a garage bigger than my studio apartment. I want to be clear, none of that ever made me want what she had. What I wanted was simpler and somehow harder to get, just to be let into the rooms where that scenery existed, even once, without being managed at the door like something that might not match the furniture. What made it worse was that I was never actually absent from the family. I was the one who drove 2 hours after a full day at the office when my dad's blood pressure spiked and my mom panicked in the emergency room parking lot. I was the one who quietly paid the difference when my parents' roof needed replacing and their savings came up $11,000 short. Ashley sent a fruit basket that year, a nice one, from a boutique shop in her neighborhood. Nobody in my family ever said thank you for the roof out loud. Not really, not in a way that acknowledged what it meant. It just became one more thing I did, like it was simply my role, my function, not a sacrifice worth noticing. I remember standing in my parents' garage the week after I wired the money for the roof, watching my dad run his hand along the new shingles like he still couldn't quite believe they were there, and feeling a strange mix of pride and exhaustion settle into my shoulders at the same time. My phone buzzed while I stood there. It was Ashley, texting from a spa day with David's sisters, asking if I'd seen the new getaway they were planning to Aspen for New Year's, complete with a link to the rental listing. 6 bedrooms, a private chef, $4,000 a night. I typed back that it looked amazing because it did, and because there was no version of that conversation where I could say, "Actually, I just spent $11,000 keeping our parents' house from leaking," without it landing as some kind of accusation neither of us was ready to have out loud. I want to be honest with you. I'm not telling you this story because I think I'm a saint. I made my peace with paying more than my share a long time ago because I loved my parents and I could afford it, and Ashley genuinely couldn't, not with the way David's family structured things around him. What I never made peace with was being hidden, being the sister nobody quite knew how to introduce. Being told, gently, sweetly, over and over, that I should keep my distance from a world I was apparently only good enough to fund from the outside, never to actually stand inside of, not even for one evening among people who would forget my name by morning anyway. The next few years the pattern only sharpened. Family dinners started splitting into two conversations at the table, one about David's new resort project in the mountains, wine pairings, private school tours for the niece and nephew, and another quieter one where I sat with my mother talking about coupon codes for prescriptions. Nobody meant it as cruelty exactly. It was just how the gravity of the room worked now, pulled toward Ashley's life because it sparkled, and mine simply didn't, at least not in a way anyone at that table understood how to see. I started dreading Sunday dinners the way you dread a dentist appointment, necessary, a little painful, over before real damage gets done. There was a Thanksgiving, my third year at Merriweather, when Ashley's mother-in-law hosted at their house in Myers Park for the first time, and my parents were actually invited, which felt like progress until I found out I wasn't. Ashley called to explain that the guest list was tight, that it was mostly David's extended family this round, that she'd make it up to me at Christmas. I sat alone in my apartment that night, eating leftover Chinese food from a container, watching my parents' Instagram photos come in from a house with a chandelier the size of my kitchen table, and I felt something in me go quiet in a way that scared me more than crying would have. Christmas that same year followed almost the exact same shape. Ashley called in early December, cheerful, already halfway into planning, to say that David's family had a tradition of a small, intimate Christmas Eve at his parents' house, and that Christmas Day itself would be ours, the real family day. Don't worry, nothing's changing there. What actually happened was that Christmas Day shrank a little more each year after that, first losing the sit-down dinner to a brunch because Ashley and David had another obligation that evening, then losing the whole afternoon the following year to a ski trip that got scheduled straight through the holiday. I stopped expecting the day to look like it used to. I just started showing up for whatever was left of it, quietly. The way I'd learned to show up for everything else, grateful for scraps of time I used to think were simply mine by right. When I did get invited to things, the introductions were their own small wound. My sister works in real estate, Ashley would say to her friends, waving a hand vaguely in my direction, like the sentence was already finished and didn't need my actual job title attached to it. Never director. Never even analyst, just real estate, the same 3 words you'd use to describe someone who sold houses part-time on weekends. Meanwhile, I was underwriting deals worth tens of millions of dollars, deals that required me to understand zoning law, debt structuring, environmental review, deals that kept me at my desk until 9 most weeknights while she introduced her husband as being in development like it was a different planet from what I did. I remember one dinner at David's parents' house early on, when a man asked me directly what I did for work, and before I could answer, Ashley jumped in and said, "Oh, she's the practical one in the family. She keeps everyone organized." The table laughed warmly, kindly even, and moved on to the next topic within seconds, and I sat there holding a glass of wine I didn't want, smiling the way you smile when you've decided a fight isn't worth having in that particular room. I told myself it was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine that year, because naming them out loud would have meant admitting how much they actually hurt, and I wasn't ready for that yet. My apartment back then was a 900 square foot, 1-bedroom in Noda, the kind of place with character, exposed brick, a window unit that rattled in August, and I loved it in a way I never quite admitted to my family, because admitting I loved my small, ordinary life would have meant admitting I didn't need theirs. I used to sit on my fire escape some nights with a glass of wine that cost $12, looking out at string lights strung between the buildings, and feel something close to contentment, right up until my phone buzzed with another photo from a rooftop bar in Charleston or a fundraiser gala at some club I'd never be invited to. It wasn't envy exactly. It was more like standing outside a window during a party, able to see clearly that the room was warm and lit and full of laughter, and still somehow never quite finding the door. If you're watching this and you've ever swallowed something like that, a comment that technically wasn't an insult but landed like one anyway, go ahead and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It helps me know this story is actually reaching people who understand it, and it costs you nothing but a few seconds. And if this is the kind of story that speaks to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one, because these stories are the only thing I've got to give back for everyone who's ever felt smaller than they actually were in their own family. The strange part is that outside my family, I was quietly building a real career. My boss, a partner at the firm named Lauren Cole, had started giving me bigger accounts around my 4th year. First a small strip mall refinance, then a mixed-use development in Southend that actually made the local business journal. Lauren was maybe 50, sharp as anything, the kind of woman who didn't waste compliments but meant everyone she gave. She started calling me into meetings with clients directly instead of just prepping the materials for someone else to present. Nobody in my family knew any of this was happening because nobody in my family had asked me a real question about my work in over 2 years. One night that spring, my dad called out of nowhere. No occasion, no favor to ask, just to talk, which was rare enough that I nearly didn't pick up thinking it was a scam call. He asked almost shyly if I actually liked my job, the kind of plain curiosity nobody in my family usually showed, and I found myself talking for 20 minutes about zoning boards and cap rates and the strange satisfaction of turning a stalled deal into a closed one, and he just listened, saying, "Huh." And that's something at the right moments, the way he used to when I was a kid explaining a science project. It wasn't much. But driving to work the next morning, I realized it was the first real conversation about my career I'd had with anyone in my family in longer than I could remember, and I held on to it for weeks. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being good at something nobody around you values. I would come home from closing a deal that took 8 months of grinding negotiation, genuinely proud, wanting to tell someone, and the person on the other end of the phone would ask about it for maybe 90 seconds before pivoting to David's new boat or Ashley's kitchen renovation. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, or at least I try not to. I say it because I think a lot of people carry accomplishments nobody in their life ever really celebrates, and you learn to celebrate quietly, alone, in your car, in a parking garage, because that's the only stage available to you. By my 5th year at Merriweather, I'd been promoted twice, and Lauren had started mentoring me in a way that felt different from just management. She'd pull me into her office after a good meeting and say, "You don't perform for the room, Rachel. You perform for the numbers, and someday the room catches up to the numbers whether it wants to or not." I didn't fully believe her at the time. I thought maybe some rooms never catch up, no matter how good the numbers get. I thought maybe my family's room was one of those, permanently arranged around Ashley's version of success, with me standing somewhere just outside the frame, useful but unseen. The Southend project that first earned Lauren's real trust in me was a mixed-use development replacing an old textile warehouse, exposed brick and steel beams the developers wanted to preserve, and I spent 3 straight weeks that spring living inside spreadsheets and zoning documents, ordering the same turkey sandwich from the deli downstairs. So often the woman behind the counter started making it before I finished asking. I remember the night we finalized the debt structure, sitting in the office at 9:30 with Lauren, the whole floor dark except our 2 desks, the Charlotte skyline lit up outside the window, and Lauren looking over the model one last time before saying, "This is clean work, Rachel, genuinely clean." And something in my chest loosened that I hadn't realized was clenched. Nobody in my family ever saw that skyline with me. I had started to make my peace with being the only witness to my own best work. Ashley, around that same time, joined a tennis league at Somerset Hills and started a book club with women from the neighborhood that met monthly to drink expensive wine and half-read whatever novel was trending that season. I know because she posted about both constantly. Courtside photos in tennis whites, flat lays of glossy hardcovers next to charcuterie boards. I don't say that to mock her life. She was allowed to enjoy what she'd built the same way I was allowed to enjoy mine, even if mine looked like takeout containers and spreadsheets at midnight. What bothered me wasn't that our lives looked different. It was that only one of those lives ever got treated by our own family as the one worth talking about at dinner. Then Ashley announced her 5-year anniversary party, and everything that had been simmering quietly for years finally came to a full boil in a single unbearable evening. She called it an anniversary celebration, but really it was David's father's 60th birthday combined with their 5-year vow renewal, hosted at Somerset Hills Country Club on the north side of Myers Park, the kind of place with a wait list for membership that outlasts most marriages. Ashley spent 4 months planning it. I know because she posted the planning process in real time. Mood boards, cake tastings, a florist flown in from Savannah. This time, for reasons I still don't fully understand, maybe guilt, maybe genuine wanting, she actually invited me, and part of me, the part that still wanted to believe things could be different, said yes before I let myself think it through. During the planning months, Ashley called me exactly once to ask for actual help, needing an extra set of hands to assemble 200 welcome bags for out-of-town guests, and I drove over on a Saturday and spent 4 hours folding tissue paper and tying ribbon around bottles of bourbon while she fielded calls from the florist and the string quartet's manager in the next room. At one point she came in, looked at the neat rows I'd assembled, and said, "You're so good at this kind of thing," half compliment, half something else I couldn't quite name, before disappearing again to take another call. I didn't mind the folding. What stayed with me was the phrase "this kind of thing," said the exact same way she used to say practical. A small, tidy box she kept sliding me into no matter how much the actual shape of my life had changed. I spent 3 weeks debating what to wear, which tells you something about where my head was. I ended up buying a dress I genuinely couldn't afford, deep green, well-tailored, from a boutique downtown because some small stubborn part of me refused to walk into that club looking like exactly what Ashley always implied I was. I remember standing in my apartment the night before, looking at myself in the mirror, thinking, "You belong in rooms like this too. You just haven't been given the chance to prove it." I didn't know yet how literally true that sentence was about to become, or how soon. The boutique where I found the dress was downtown, small and quiet, run by a woman named Brittany who'd opened it 2 years earlier after leaving a corporate job herself, and when I told her, almost apologetically, that I probably couldn't afford the alterations on top of the dress, she waved a hand and said, "Honey, you're going to walk into that room like you own it. The hem is on me." I hadn't expected to cry in a dressing room over a hem, but I did, quietly, for about 30 seconds before wiping my eyes and laughing at myself in the mirror. It's strange what kindness from a stranger can do to you when you've spent years absorbing small cruelties from your own family. I left that boutique feeling, for the first time in a long time, like I was preparing for battle instead of just another evening of being politely erased. At work that same week, something big was moving. Lauren called me into her office on a Tuesday and told me Merriweather had been approached about representing a potential buyer on the Ashworth Collection, a portfolio of 6 boutique hotels across the Carolinas, valued at around $180 million. It was the kind of deal that made careers. Lauren said the buyer's team wanted a lead point of contact who actually understood the hospitality underwriting model inside and out, and she was putting my name forward. I remember sitting there, feeling my pulse in my ears, thinking this could be the deal that finally proved everything I'd spent 7 years quietly building actually meant something. I didn't know the buyer's name yet. Lauren said it would be revealed once the non-disclosure paperwork cleared. Standard for a deal that size, and I didn't push, because in my world, you learn patience the hard way, one closing at a time. I remember driving home that night, with the windows down even though it was cold, feeling something close to hope for the first time in a long while, hope about work, hope that maybe this was the beginning of the room finally catching up to the numbers, the way Lauren always promised it eventually would, whether the room wanted it to or not. The morning of the party, my phone buzzed with a group text from Ashley, all lowercase, casual on the surface, but carrying an edge underneath that I'd learned to recognize. "Hey, so tonight is pretty formal. Lots of David's business world. Maybe keep the work talk light a lol. People here don't really get into shop talk the way you do." I read it twice, sitting on the edge of my bed already half dressed, and felt that familiar cold drop in my stomach. The one that told me nothing had actually changed, that the invitation had never really meant what I hoped it meant, that I was still, after everything, being managed, packaged, kept quiet. I almost didn't go. I sat on my bed for a full 20 minutes with the dress still on its hanger, seriously considering texting back that I had a headache, that something came up at work, any of the easy exits I'd used a dozen times before. But something in me, some stubborn thread that had been fraying for years, refused to let Ashley's text be the last word. I told myself I would go, I would be gracious, I would not make a scene, and I would simply exist in that room as myself on my own terms, whether her friends understood what I did for a living or not. I had no idea how sharply that decision was about to be tested. Somerset Hills Country Club sat behind a stone gate with a guard checking names off a list. Past a driveway lined with valets in white gloves parking Range Rovers and a single silver Bentley that made my Honda feel like a joke I'd told on myself by even showing up in it. Inside, the ballroom was lit gold, string quartet in the corner, a raw bar with oysters on ice, the kind of catered abundance that makes you acutely aware of every dollar you've ever had to think twice about. There was an ice sculpture near the entrance shaped like the numeral 5 for the anniversary, already beginning to weep small rivers onto its silver tray, and a wall of white orchids behind the head table that I later learned had been flown in that morning from Miami. A photographer moved through the crowd discreetly, the kind hired specifically not to be noticed until you saw the proofs weeks later, and a coat check attendant took my thin wool coat with a polite nod that made me acutely aware it probably cost less than the tip jar beside her. I stood near the entrance for a moment, just breathing it in, the gold light, the hum of low, expensive conversation, telling myself, quietly, that I had every right to be standing there, even as some old familiar part of me waited for someone to ask why. I found Ashley near the entrance in a champagne-colored gown, laughing with a cluster of women I didn't recognize, and when she saw me, her smile flickered just for a second before she recovered it. She introduced me to the group as my sister, Rachel. She's in real estate too, actually, which was, I'll admit, slightly more than I'd gotten before, and for one foolish moment I let myself hope the evening might go differently than the ones before it. A woman named Chloe asked what firm I was with, and before I could answer with the word director attached to my name for the first time in front of any of them, Ashley cut in smoothly and said, "Oh, it's a smaller local shop, nothing like what David's family does," and the conversation dissolved into talk of a resort opening in the mountains before I'd even finished forming my sentence. A few minutes later, David's mother approached to say hello. Warm in the practiced way of someone who has hosted 1,000 parties, and asked what I did for work before Ashley could intercept the question this time. I told her clearly I'm a director at a commercial real estate investment firm downtown, and watched her eyebrows lift slightly, genuine interest flickering across her face for just a moment. "Oh, how interesting," she said. "We should talk sometime." David's always looking for sharp people on the acquisition side, and for one brief hopeful second, I thought maybe the evening might actually crack open into something different. Then Ashley reappeared at her elbow with a fresh glass of wine and steered the conversation smoothly toward the string quartet's next set, and the moment closed as quickly as it had opened. I want you to understand something about moments like that. They don't feel like a slap. They feel like a paper cut, small, precise, and somehow worse because everyone around you is smiling while it happens, and you're the only one who clocks the sting. I stood there holding a glass of champagne I didn't taste, watching my sister redirect an entire room away from the one true thing I might have said about myself, and I understood, with a clarity that almost felt peaceful, that this had never been an accident. This was a pattern with a purpose, whether Ashley admitted it to herself or not, and the purpose was keeping me small enough to fit into the shape she needed me to occupy. If any part of tonight's story is landing for you the way I think it might, this is usually the point where I ask you to hit that subscribe button, because the middle of a story like this is exactly where a lot of people give up on themselves too. I didn't give up that night, and I'm about to tell you why, but subscribing costs you nothing, and it tells me these stories are actually reaching the people who need to hear that it gets better. It always helps more than you'd think. Dinner was seated, and somehow, whether by accident or design, I ended up at a table near the back. close to the kitchen doors next to an elderly aunt of David's who fell asleep somewhere between the salad and the entree. Ashley sat at the head table with David, his parents, and a rotating cast of what I can only describe as Charlotte's quietest, most expensively dressed people, men in perfectly cut suits who spoke in low voices about deals and boards and second homes in a way that made it clear this world ran on connections I had spent my whole career trying to earn from the outside in, one underwriting model at a time. Around 8:30 my phone buzzed in my clutch, and I felt it before I even looked. That particular vibration pattern I'd set for anything from Lauren. I stepped just outside the ballroom doors into the hallway to check it, and my stomach dropped in the good way this time, the way that means something enormous is happening. Lauren had texted that the Ashworth Collection buyer wanted to move the closing timeline up by 2 weeks and needed our full underwriting package finalized by end of day Monday, and that the buyer specifically wanted the lead analyst, meaning me, on a call first thing in the morning to walk through valuation assumptions personally. I stood in that marble hallway with my heart racing, typing back a quick confirmation, feeling for the first time all night like myself again. Like the version of me that mattered somewhere, even if it wasn't in that ballroom. I slipped my phone back into my clutch and turned to go back inside, and that's when I saw Ashley standing a few feet away near the coat check, arms crossed, watching me with an expression I recognized instantly, the same tight, apologetic, embarrassed look she used to get in high school right before she asked me to wait in the car so her friends wouldn't see who'd driven her. "Rachel?" she said, low enough that only I could hear, but sharp enough that it cut anyway. "Can you please not be on your phone in the middle of David's dad's party? People are going to think you don't want to be here." I told her it was work, something urgent, a deal closing. She let out a short laugh that had no warmth in it at all and said, "Of course it's work. It's always work with you. Can you just for one night pretend you have a life outside of your little office?" And I felt my face go hot in a way I hadn't experienced since I was a teenager standing in that same posture of quiet, practiced shame. I didn't argue. I want you to know that. Because I think it matters. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I didn't even really defend myself beyond a quiet, "It's actually a big deal, Ash." She waved a hand and said something about how everyone has a big deal. David closes bigger deals before breakfast, and she turned and walked back toward the ballroom without waiting to see how her words landed, the way people do when they've said something like that so many times before that they no longer expect it to leave a mark. This time, it left more than a mark. This time, something in me finally, quietly, permanently closed a door. Before I found my mother to say goodnight, I ducked into the club's marble bathroom and stood at the sink for a moment, gripping the edge of it, looking at my own reflection under lighting so flattering it almost felt cruel given the circumstances. I did not cry. I want to be honest that some small, tired part of me wanted to. But instead, I just breathed, in for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, a trick a therapist had taught me 2 years earlier during a stretch when work stress had gotten bad enough that I'd finally, reluctantly, made an appointment. I looked at myself and thought, you did not do anything wrong tonight, and for once standing in that pristine bathroom paid for by people who would never know my name past this evening, I actually believed the sentence instead of just repeating it. I stood alone in that hallway for maybe 2 full minutes, and I made a decision that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. I was not going to make a scene. I was not going to cry in a country club bathroom while a string quartet played somewhere down the hall. I was simply going to leave, quietly, the way I always left things, except this time the leaving meant something different. I walked back in just long enough to find my mother, kiss her cheek, tell her I had an early morning, and walk out through those same white-gloved valets without saying another word to my sister, who was already laughing again with her friends by the raw bar, as if the last 5 minutes had never happened at all. Driving home that night, I didn't cry either, which surprised me. I felt something steadier than sadness settle into my chest, something closer to resolve. I remember gripping the steering wheel at a red light on Providence Road, looking at my own reflection faintly in the windshield and thinking, this is the last time I shrink myself for a room that was never going to make space for me anyway. Not out of bitterness toward Ashley exactly, more like a quiet withdrawal of something I'd been offering for free for years, my patience, my hope, my willingness to keep proving myself to people who had already decided who I was a long time ago and weren't interested in updating the file. I didn't tell my family about the Ashworth deal moving up. I didn't tell them about the call scheduled for the next morning, or the fact that Lauren had personally recommended me to run point on a $180 million acquisition. I stopped explaining my work to people who had already decided it wasn't worth explaining. Instead, I went home, changed out of that green dress I'd bought with money I didn't really have, made myself a cup of tea, and reviewed the Ashworth underwriting model for 2 hours at my kitchen table, because that model, unlike my family, actually wanted my full attention, and for once I gave it freely without apologizing for the space it took up in my life. The call the next morning ran an hour and a half, and I was sharp, prepared, and completely in my element in a way I hadn't felt in months. The buyer's representative on the line, a man who introduced himself only as part of the principal's family office, asked detailed questions about occupancy trends, debt service coverage, capital expenditure reserves, and I answered every single one without hesitation, because I had lived inside those numbers for weeks. When the call ended, Lauren pulled me aside and said, "Whoever's family office that is, they were testing you and you passed with room to spare. They want an in-person walkthrough of the model next week, and they specifically asked for you by name." Over the following weeks, I threw myself into that deal in a way that felt less like ambition and more like coming home to a version of myself I'd been neglecting. I redrafted the offering summary twice. I flew to Raleigh for one site visit and drove to the coast for another, walking through boutique hotel lobbies with a clipboard, checking roof conditions and parking capacity and event space utilization, the unglamorous work nobody posts photos of, the work that actually decides whether $180 million is well spent or wasted. My family, as far as I know, had no idea any of this was happening. I had stopped narrating my life to people who only half listened. About 2 weeks into the Ashworth deal ramping up, my mother called on a Sunday to ask if I'd come to a family lunch honoring David's father's retirement from his firm's board, an event I hadn't even known was happening until that call. I told her, gently but clearly, that I had work I couldn't move, which was true, and also, for the first time, I didn't spend the next 10 minutes apologizing or offering to swing by afterward for even 20 minutes. My mother went quiet for a second, clearly unused to that particular shape of no coming from me, before saying, "Okay, honey, I understand," in a tone that told me she didn't fully understand yet, but might be starting to. It was a small moment. It was also the first time in years I'd said no to my family without immediately trying to make the no smaller. There was a mini turning point around this time that I think about often. Lauren told me, almost offhand, that the buyer's principal had specifically requested that I present the final valuation summary in person rather than sending a junior associate, which almost never happened at that stage of a deal this size. She said, "In this business, when the principal wants you in the room, that means you're not support staff anymore. That means you're the deal." I remember writing that sentence down on a sticky note and putting it on my monitor, not because I needed the validation exactly, but because some small, tired part of me had needed someone, anyone, to say out loud that I had actually built something real. 2 days before the final walkthrough meeting, Lauren finally told me the buyer's name. Now that the paperwork had cleared and confidentiality had lifted enough for internal planning, the acquisition was being led personally by a man named Michael Sinclair, founder of a private investment firm out of Richmond that had quietly built one of the largest boutique hospitality portfolios on the East Coast. I recognized the name vaguely, the way you recognize a name from society, pages you never really read closely, and thought nothing more of it. I had no reason yet to connect Michael Sinclair to anything in my personal life, no reason at all until the morning of the meeting itself. The morning of the walk-through, I dressed carefully, a charcoal suit I'd bought specifically for moments like this one, hair pulled back, a single pair of pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's. I reviewed my talking points one final time in the elevator, feeling the particular calm that comes right before something important. Not nerves exactly, more like readiness, the feeling of a muscle you've spent years training finally being asked to perform. Lauren met me outside the 12th floor conference room and said, They're already inside. Small group. Keep it tight. You know this model better than anyone alive. Go show them. I walked into that conference room with my laptop under my arm and my head held higher than it had been in months, and the first thing I registered was the skyline view behind the long glass table. The second thing I registered a half-second later in a jolt that traveled through my entire body was my sister Ashley sitting near the window beside David, both of them apparently there because David's company was serving as a co-broker on a related property adjacent to the Ashworth portfolio, a connection nobody had thought to mention to me and nobody could have possibly known would collide with my morning like this. Before I could fully process what I was looking at, a man rose from the head of the table, silver-haired, easily in his 60s, wearing the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from decades of being the most important person in every room he enters. I recognized his face immediately, with a lurch that nearly stopped my breath because I had seen it 3 weeks earlier across a ballroom at Somerset Hills Country Club. Laughing near the Raw Bar with a group that included my own sister, a man I now understood had been standing not 15 feet away from me the entire night. I'd been humiliated in that hallway and quietly told to leave early. Michael Sinclair extended his hand toward me before Lauren could even finish the introduction and said with genuine warmth in his voice, "You must be Director Doyle. I've heard nothing but excellent things. Your model on the Asheville property alone told me everything I needed to know about who I wanted running point on this." He said it clearly, fully, in a room gone suddenly, completely silent, and I felt the word director land in the air like something solid. Something that couldn't be waved away or softened into vague real estate the way it always had been before. I shook his hand and heard myself say, "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. It's a pleasure to finally put a face to the file." I did not look at Ashley right away. I made myself finish the handshake. Make eye contact with Michael, breathe once, steady before I let my gaze drift 2 seats down to where my sister sat frozen, her champagne-colored composure from 3 weeks ago nowhere in sight, replaced by something I had genuinely never seen on her face before, a kind of stunned, unguarded shock, the look of someone watching a story rearrange itself in real time. David, beside her, glanced between Michael and me with visible confusion, clearly working out the connection none of us had known existed until that exact second in that exact room. Michael, without any idea of the family drama he'd just detonated, gestured for everyone to sit and slid a bound copy of the acquisition summary across the table toward me, the cover page printed cleanly with my name and title, Rachel Doyle, Director of Acquisitions, Merriweather Group. The same words Ashley had talked over 3 weeks earlier, as though they weren't worth finishing a sentence about. I ran my palm once over the cool laminate cover before opening my laptop, a small habit of mine before any big presentation, and I noticed my hand wasn't shaking, which surprised me almost as much as anything else happening in that room. Lauren caught my eye from across the table just for a second, a small nod that said, "You've got this." And I realized in that instant that the steadiness I felt had nothing to do with Michael Sinclair's approval, and everything to do with the hundreds of hours I'd already put into knowing this deal better than anyone else in the building. Whatever happened next with Ashley, whatever her face was doing 2 seats down, the actual ground I was standing on had been built long before either of us walked into that room that morning. I opened my laptop, pulled up the valuation model, and for the next 45 minutes I did the thing I actually knew how to do better than almost anyone in that building, walking the room through debt structuring, cap rates, and projected returns with a steadiness that surprised even me. Given everything happening underneath the surface of that meeting, I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, some cinematic swell of vindication, but honestly, what I felt was quieter than that, and somehow more solid. I felt like myself, fully, without apology, in a room where my actual work finally spoke louder than any introduction my sister had ever offered on my behalf. When the meeting ended and Michael shook my hand again, saying he looked forward to closing with me personally, I finally allowed myself one glance at Ashley, who was still sitting there, quiet, pale, unable to find whatever version of her usual smooth deflection might have covered this particular moment. The days after that meeting were strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. Ashley called twice that same evening and I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I genuinely needed time to sit with what had happened, before I let anyone, even my own sister, tell me how I should feel about it. When I finally called her back 2 days later, her voice was different, smaller somehow, and she said, "I didn't know, Rachel. I swear I had no idea Michael Sinclair was your client." And I told her, gently but clearly, that wasn't actually the point. And she went quiet on the other end of the line in a way that told me she understood, finally, what I meant. She tried to explain herself the way people do when they're cornered by their own pattern laid bare in front of them. She said she never meant to make me feel small, that she just got caught up in David's world, that she didn't realize how it looked from the outside until she watched Michael Sinclair say the word director and saw her own husband's confused face beside her. I listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, I said something I'd been carrying for years without quite knowing how to phrase it. I told her, "I was always this person, Ashley. You just never wanted to see it, and that's a different problem than the one you're apologizing for right now." I didn't yell at her. I didn't list every slight going back a decade, though God knows I could have. I simply told her that, going forward, I wasn't interested in being introduced vaguely, hidden at back tables, or asked to keep quiet about a career I had built with my own 2 hands while she was busy building an entirely different kind of life. I told her I loved her, and that I meant that, but that love didn't obligate me to keep shrinking so she could feel comfortable. She cried a little on the phone, and for once I let the silence sit there instead of rushing to comfort her, the way I always used to, because some silences need to be felt all the way through, not managed away. The Ashworth deal closed 6 weeks later on schedule at $182 million, slightly above the original ask, and Lauren made me a full equity partner at the firm that same quarter, the youngest partner in Merriweather's history. My parents came to the small celebration dinner the firm held, and for the first time in years I watched my father actually read my title off the little engraved nameplate they gave me, Rachel Doyle, partner, mouthing the words slowly like he was seeing them for the first time, which in a way he was because nobody had ever handed him the chance to read them clearly before. Ashley came to that dinner too. She sat near the back, quieter than I'd ever seen her at any family event. And afterward she pulled me aside and asked carefully if she could take me to lunch sometime. Just the 2 of us, no David, no friends from the club. We went 2 weeks later to a small place near my office, and she asked me real questions about my work for the first time in longer than I could remember, and actually listened to the answers instead of glancing at her phone or steering the conversation somewhere more comfortable for her. It wasn't a perfect repair. Some things don't repair perfectly, but it was honest, and honest was more than I'd had from her in years. At that lunch, Ashley asked me to actually explain what a cap rate was, sitting there with her salad going untouched, and I found myself walking her through it the way I would a junior analyst, and she listened, really listened, asking follow-up questions instead of glancing toward the door. At one point she put her fork down and said, "I think I've spent so long needing my life to look a certain way that I stopped noticing yours was actually the impressive one." And I didn't say anything right away because I wasn't ready to just hand that sentence back to her, wrapped in forgiveness. I said simply, "That means something, thank you for saying it," and left it there because some repairs need to be built slowly, one honest lunch at a time, not resolved in a single tidy conversation over salad. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters more than the satisfying part of this story. I didn't forgive Ashley because Michael Sinclair validated me in that conference room. I would have been exactly as worthy of respect if that meeting had never happened, if no rich client had ever walked in and said the right word at the right moment in front of the right people. What that meeting did was force my sister to see something that had been true the entire time, whether she looked at it or not. My worth was never dependent on her recognizing it. I only wish I hadn't spent so many years quietly waiting for permission to believe that myself. These days, family dinners look different. I still show up. I still help my parents when they need it because that's simply who I am, and I don't need Ashley's world to validate that instinct in me either. But I don't hide anymore, and I don't shrink my sentences down to fit whatever size someone else finds comfortable. When people ask what I do, I say it plainly now. I'm a partner at a real estate investment firm, and I let the sentence stand there, complete, without apologizing for the space it takes up in the conversation. It's a small thing, It changed everything about how I move through rooms that used to make me feel invisible. A few months later, at a regular Sunday dinner, this time at my parents' house, not some club, Ashley brought David along. And when her father-in-law's business partner happened to be visiting town and joined for coffee afterward, Ashley introduced me without hesitation. This is my sister, Rachel. She's a partner at Merriweather Group. She actually led the Ashworth acquisition you probably read about. It was such a small sentence. It took maybe 4 seconds to say. But I felt something settle in my chest hearing it. Not triumph exactly, more like a door that had been stuck for 15 years finally swinging open on its own. Quietly, without anyone having to force it. I didn't make a big deal of it. I just said thank you and asked the business partner a real question about his own work, and the conversation moved on naturally, the way conversations are supposed to move when nobody's managing anyone else's image for them anymore. If there's one thing I hope you take from tonight's story, it's this. You don't need someone else's recognition to know what you've actually built, but you also don't have to keep quietly accepting a smaller version of yourself just because it's easier for the people around you. I didn't need Michael Sinclair's handshake to know I was good at my job. I needed it to stop apologizing for taking up space in a room I had already earned a seat in a long time before he ever walked into it. I hope somewhere in this story, you found a piece of your own. If you've made it this far, thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with me and with Rachel's story tonight. These stories take real work to put together, and the only thing that keeps this channel going is people like you choosing to hit subscribe and stick around for the next one. It doesn't cost anything, and it means everything on this end. Wherever you're watching from, whatever room you've ever felt too small for, I hope you remember that you never needed their applause to know exactly what you were worth all along. I'll see you in the next story.